Intro music. Dramatic. Slightly melancholic classical piece. Visual. Opening shot of Windsor Castle. Perhaps under a grey sky. Then a slow zoom into an old, faded portrait of King George III. A flicker of sadness in his eyes. Narrator. For centuries, he has been known to history as the Mad King George, the monarch who lost America, whose later years descended into a bewildering, tragic spiral of mental and physical decline. But what if the truth behind King George III's infamous madness is far more complex? A story of a man battling not just empires, but a mysterious, tormenting illness within his own mind. What if his suffering was a medical mystery, misunderstood by an age without modern science? Join us as we peel back the layers of royal history to uncover the human tragedy and enduring enigma of King George III's affliction. Visual. Montage of images. 18th century London. Political cartoons. Early maps of the American colonies. A younger George III looking resolute. Narrator. Born on the 4th of June 1738. George William Frederick ascended the throne of Great Britain and Ireland on the 25th of October 1760. At the tender age of 22, he was the first Hanoverian monarch to be born in Britain and to speak English as his first language, declaring proudly in his accession speech, "Born and educated in this country, I glory in the name of Britain." He harbored a profound desire to be a patriot king, to restore dignity and stability to a monarchy that had, under his predecessors, become somewhat detached from the affairs of state. He aimed to govern effectively, to rise above the factionalism of Whig and Tory politics, and to be a moral example to his subjects. For the first 2 decades of his reign, he largely succeeded in projecting an image of steadfastness and domestic virtue, particularly alongside his beloved wife, Queen Charlotte, with whom he had 15 children. He was, by all accounts, a conscientious, if sometimes stubborn, ruler. He took a keen interest in agriculture, earning him the nickname Farmer George, and was a patron of the arts and sciences, founding the Royal Academy of Arts. Visual. Close-up on a map of the American colonies. Then a transition to a dramatic painting of a battle scene from the American Revolutionary War. Narrator. However, his reign was soon overshadowed by monumental political upheaval, most notably the escalating tensions with the American colonies. George III firmly believed in upholding the authority of Parliament and the Crown over the colonies, a stance that ultimately led to the American War of Independence, commencing in 1775. The loss of the American colonies in 1783 was a profound personal and political blow to the king. He considered abdicating, feeling he had failed his people. The stress and humiliation of this period undoubtedly took a heavy toll on his physical and mental well-being, though the first truly public and alarming signs of his illness wouldn't manifest for several more years. Visual. A more somber portrait of George III, perhaps looking older and more strained. Then, an interior shot of a grand Georgian drawing room. Narrator. While often associated with the later, severe bouts, it's a compelling historical fact that King George III likely experienced milder, shorter episodes of illness much earlier in his reign. Historians and medical scholars have identified a brief but significant episode in 1765, when he suffered from a high fever, a rapid pulse, and a rash. He was reportedly confused and incoherent, causing considerable concern amongst his ministers. This early, less severe incident provides crucial context. suggesting a recurrent, perhaps hereditary, condition rather than a sudden onset of madness later in life. These earlier episodes, however, were carefully concealed from the public, a testament to the monarchy's desperate efforts to maintain an image of stability and strength. Source: McAlpine, I. and Hunter, R. 1969. George III and the Mad Business. Visual: a dramatic reenactment or painting depicting the king in distress, attended by worried courtiers. Transition to images of panicked ministers. Narrator: the year 1788, however, brought the illness to a terrifying, undeniable climax. In the summer, the king's health began to visibly deteriorate. He complained of severe abdominal pains, constipation, and suffered from a persistent, painful rash. But it was his mental state that caused the greatest alarm. By November, his behavior became erratic, his speech rapid, rambling, and often incoherent. He would talk for hours without pause, repeating phrases, using inappropriate language, and displaying bizarre, agitated movements. He suffered from extreme insomnia, sometimes going for days without sleep, and would wander the palace corridors, disturbing servants and courtiers. He addressed inanimate objects as if they were people, and on one occasion, tried to shake hands with a tree, believing it was the King of Prussia. His eyes were bloodshot, his pulse racing, and he frequently foamed at the mouth. Visual: close-up on a political cartoon from the era, depicting Pitt and Fox. Then, a more formal painting of Parliament. Narrator: this dramatic decline plunged Britain into a profound constitutional crisis, known as the Regency Crisis of 1788–89. With the king clearly incapacitated, the question of who would govern became paramount. The two dominant political figures, Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger and the leader of the opposition, Charles James Fox, found themselves at loggerheads. Fox, a close friend of the Prince of Wales, argued that the prince, as heir apparent, had an automatic right to assume the regency. Pitt, wary of Fox's influence over the prince and fearing a wholesale change of government, argued that Parliament had the right to appoint a regent and to impose restrictions on their power. The political stakes were incredibly high, with the fate of the government and potentially the monarchy hanging in the balance. It's a compelling historical fact that the crisis almost led to the Prince of Wales, later George IV, taking full power, fundamentally altering the course of British politics. Source: Canon. J. 1994. The Fox-North Coalition. Crisis of the Constitution 1782–4. Visual: illustrations of 18th-century medical practices, perhaps a doctor with leeches, or a restraint chair. Avoid overly graphic imagery but convey the harshness. Narrator: the medical treatment offered to the king was, by today's standards, horrific. The physicians of the era possessed little understanding of mental illness, often attributing it to moral failing or imbalances of the humors. The king was subjected to a battery of harsh, invasive, and ineffective treatments. These included blistering agents applied to his skin, purges, emetics to induce vomiting, and copious bloodletting. Perhaps most distressing was the use of physical restraints. The king was often tied into a chair or to his bed, sometimes for hours, to prevent his agitated movements. He was also placed under the care of Dr. Francis Willis, a clergyman turned physician who specialized in the treatment of lunacy. Willis employed a controversial but surprisingly effective approach for the time, combining firm psychological management with strict control. He believed in breaking the patient's will, often threatening and intimidating the king. While undeniably cruel, Willis's methods were seen as a radical alternative to simple confinement. Visual. A painting of a joyous public celebration. Bonfires. Fireworks. Then, a serene portrait of a seemingly recovered George III. Narrator. Miraculously, by February 1789, the king began to recover. His speech became coherent. His agitation subsided, and he was able to sleep. By March, he was declared fully recovered, much to the relief of the nation and the chagrin of the opposition. His recovery was met with widespread public rejoicing. Bonfires were lit, and Thanksgiving services held across the country. It was a powerful moment of national unity, cementing the king's popularity and further endearing Farmer George to his subjects. It's a compelling historical fact that despite losing America, his later illness garnered widespread public sympathy, significantly improving his personal image and reinforcing the emotional connection between the monarch and his people. Visual. A timeline showing periods of stability and decline. Then, images of the Napoleonic Wars. Narrator. The king enjoyed over 2 decades of relative stability after this major episode, though he experienced further, milder relapses in 1801 and 1804. The immense stress of the Napoleonic Wars and the constant threat of French invasion undoubtedly contributed to these periods of fragile health. However, the final, irreversible decline began in 1810. This time, there would be no recovery. His symptoms returned with devastating force. Profound confusion, hallucinations, paranoia, and continuous, incoherent rambling. He also began to lose his sight, eventually becoming completely blind, and his hearing deteriorated significantly. Visual. A somber painting of the Prince Regent. An interior shot of a darkened, quiet room. Narrator. By 1811. His condition was so severe and clearly permanent that a Second Regency Act was passed. This time, the Prince of Wales was appointed Prince Regent, with full powers, though the king retained his title for the remaining decade of his life. George III lived in tragic isolation at Windsor Castle, blind, largely deaf, and utterly lost to his own mind. He would often play his harpsichord for hours, sometimes believing he was communicating with angels or addressing Parliament. He was known to sing hymns and speak to imaginary companions. It's a truly heartbreaking historical fact that for the last decade of his life, the king was blind and largely deaf, often playing the harpsichord to an empty room, lost in his own world, unaware of the world-altering events unfolding around him, including the Battle of Waterloo. Source: Brooke, J. 1972. King George III. Visual. Medical diagrams or illustrations showing porphyria symptoms, or a genetic tree highlighting inherited conditions. Narrator. So, what was the true nature of King George III's illness? For centuries, it remained a mystery, attributed simply to madness. However, in the 20th century, a groundbreaking medical diagnosis emerged. In 1968, British psychiatrists Dr. Ida McAlpine and Dr. Richard Hunter published their compelling theory that King George III suffered from porphyria, a rare, inherited metabolic disorder. Their research, based on meticulous analysis of royal archives, medical records, and the king's own letters, provided strong evidence. Visual. Close-up on historical documents. A magnified view of a blue-stained fabric or document. Narrator. Porphyria. Specifically acute intermittent porphyria. AIP. Causes a buildup of porphyrin precursors in the body, which can have devastating effects on the nervous system. The symptoms align remarkably well with the king's documented illness. Severe abdominal pain, rapid heart rate, muscle weakness, constipation, insomnia, paranoia, hallucinations, and rapid, incoherent speech. A crucial piece of evidence, a compelling historical fact, came from observations of the king's urine, which was occasionally noted by his physicians to be of a deep purple or blue. Porphyrin precursors, when exposed to light, can oxidize and turn urine a reddish purple or even blue color. Furthermore, the hereditary nature of porphyria was identified, with several of George III's descendants showing similar symptoms, including his granddaughter Princess Charlotte and others in the House of Hanover. Source: McAlpine, I. and Hunter, R. 1969. George III and the Mad Business. Visual. Modern scientific lab equipment. Then a thoughtful portrait of a doctor. Narrator. While the porphyria theory is widely accepted, it's not without its detractors. Some historians and medical professionals propose alternative or coexisting diagnoses, such as bipolar disorder, due to the cyclical nature of his illness with periods of mania and depression. Others have suggested arsenic poisoning or even lead poisoning from medicines or cosmetics of the era. However, the weight of evidence, particularly the specific constellation of physical and mental symptoms, the blue urine, and the hereditary pattern, makes porphyria the strongest and most widely endorsed explanation. The exact triggers for his attacks are also debated, but stress, certain medications, and dietary factors are known to exacerbate porphyria, all of which would have been prevalent in his life. Visual. A final, dignified portrait of George III. Then, a slow pan across the modern British Parliament building or Buckingham Palace. Narrator. King George III died on the 29th of January 1820, at the age of 81, having reigned for nearly 60 years. His long and tumultuous reign, defined by the loss of America and the triumph over Napoleon, was tragically bookended by periods of profound mental suffering. His illness profoundly impacted the British monarchy and political landscape, leading to the establishment of the Regency and fundamentally altering the relationship between the monarch and Parliament. But beyond the political machinations and medical mysteries, his story is a poignant reminder of the human vulnerability that lies beneath the crown. It forces us to reconsider madness not as a moral failing, but as a medical condition, deserving of empathy and understanding. King George III, the Mad King, was ultimately a man tormented by an unseen enemy, a monarch who, despite his personal struggles, left an indelible mark on British history. His legacy is not just one of empire and revolution, but also of a deeply personal battle against an illness that modern science only began to unravel centuries later. Outro music gently fades in, reflective and poignant. Narrator. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the mind of King George III. If you found this historical exploration compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to our channel for more historical insights. and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. End screen with channel branding and links.